Thanks very much, Cass. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here with you and to facilitate the first session today, where we're going to be talking about all things global economy. In the room, we have two panellists joining us today in person. We have Paul Bloxham here, who is Chief Economist for Australia and New Zealand and Global Commodities at HSBC. So welcome to Paul. And we've also got Andrew Boak, who's Managing Director and Chief Economist for Australia and New Zealand at Goldman Sachs. Thank you, Andrew, for being here with us today. We also have one panellist joining us online. Now, you will see in your programs that Marika Blom was expected to join us, and unfortunately she's been called away at the last minute. So we're very thankful that Bert Coline has stepped in to replace her. Bert is Senior Economist for the Eurozone for ING Group. So welcome and good evening to you in Amsterdam, Bert. So today we're going to run the session. I'm going to start with a few questions for our panellists, but we're really keen to get through as many of your questions from the audience as we can. As Cassandra has already mentioned, you can ask your questions through Pigeonhole. The link and the password will be up on the screen, or you've also got the QR codes on your table. You can also go directly to ceda.pigeonhole.at, and the password is EPO 2024. And the beauty of Pigeonhole is, as well as asking questions, you can also vote on your favourite questions. So please do so. I'll see those filtering up to the top of the list, and we'll make sure that we ask the most burning questions from the audience here today. So do start to get those questions flowing through. But while you're thinking about those curly questions for our panellists, I'll start with one for each of them. And Paul, I'll go to you first. So if we cast our minds back a year ago, we were all worried about where the global economy was heading. You know, we thought that maybe some of the major economies would enter recession, but as it turned out, global growth proved to be more resilient than we expected, particularly in the US. So can you set the scene for us? What is your assessment of the current state of the global economy, and what are the major risks and opportunities on the horizon that could impact Australia over the year ahead?
Certainly, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. I do think that's about right. I think if I sit here right now and look forward for this year, things feel a bit better than they did about this time last year. If you cast your mind back to early last year, the challenge the world was facing, particularly the Western world, was that inflation had accelerated. It had gotten to levels we hadn't seen in multiple decades. Central banks around the world were scrambling to do something about it. And I guess there were two really big questions at the beginning of last year that were really occupying policymakers' minds. And the first was, is inflation now going to stay high for a persistent period of time? Is that going to be the challenge we face? And the other one was, well, in order to get inflation down, are we going to have a global recession? And as it turns out, when you sit here right now and look at where we are, neither of those things have played out quite that way. Inflation has come down. It's not quite at central banks' targets yet, but it's getting there. It's certainly moved a long way, and it's moving in the right direction. And, of course, we haven't had a global recession to get there. It hasn't been an even picture. The way I look at it, and I think you hinted at that in the form of the question, is that the US has done this in a way that is quite impressive. I think the term that I've been using borrowing from someone actually, is that the US has managed to pull off an immaculate disinflation, right? They've managed to disinflate their economy without actually having to have a recession. And that's a very positive story, really, for them. Europe's had a tougher time. Europe has disinflated by having an economic slump that's been quite extended. So if you sort of come back to a framework and say, well, what's going on? Well, when we came out of the pandemic, demand accelerated well ahead of supply, the ability of the economy to deliver, and that gave us the inflation. There were two sort of essential options to be able to get inflation to come down. Either demand slowed down or supply improved. And it seems, at least the way I would think about it, the US, well, because it's got demand that's holding up pretty well, growth's holding up well, job creation's holding up well, the unemployment rate's quite low, and they've got the disinflation. Well, what they've had is an improvement on the supply side, not just the pandemic-related disruptions dissipating, but also they've had a cyclical upswing in productivity. They've had an improvement in productivity, and we might talk about that a little later in the context of Australia, how have they done it and so on, because actually they are having a productivity improvement that's allowing them to disinflate the easiest way. Europe doesn't look like that. Europe's story is that inflation has come down because they've had an economic slump for the past 5 quarters, no GDP growth for 5 quarters. And if we put Australia in that context, we haven't had quite the slowdown in demand, And we certainly haven't had much of an improvement on the supply side, and inflation's coming down more slowly. And I'm going to stop there. But I think it's a fair remark that we look as though we're in a bit better shape at the moment than we did a year ago when that inflation was a really big and formidable challenge.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Absolutely. A bit of optimism there, which is good to see. Andrew, I'm going to come to you now. In contrast to the sort of view for the global economy a year ago, when we cast our minds back then, China was really the bright spot. We were seeing them come out of their post-pandemic lockdowns. There was a rebound from that, but now that's all behind us, and there are some real concerns about the outlook for China, especially in the property market. How are you seeing economic conditions currently playing out in China, and what are the likely impacts for Australia?
Thanks, Melissa, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Look, we're expecting GDP growth in China a little bit below 5% this year. I mean, as you highlight, they've got a bit of an issue in their property market at the moment, so that's certainly a headwind. But we think that Chinese policymakers are actually doing just enough to backstop the economy to hit something close to their growth target of around 5%. So, a number of different measures across monetary policy, and we saw the rate cut earlier in the week, fiscal policy, a number of different measures in the housing market, urban regeneration, investments in green technology, electric vehicles. There's this big push for quality growth. There are a lot of sort of small things happening that aren't the big bang, big bazooka stimulus that we've seen in prior cycles. So it is quite a different experience, I think. It has surprised us, to be fair. We thought they would be a bit more aggressive earlier on. But it is, a more incremental, a more cautious approach, and the cumulative effect of all these policies we think is doing just enough to sort of backstop the economy. So I think one of the interesting questions, why are Chinese policymakers doing something a little bit different? I think there are a few reasons. Firstly, they're obviously a bit worried about the vulnerabilities that come with all that debt, so they don't want to repeat that mistake. Secondly, President Xi has all the powers, calling all the shots, a big focus on quality rather than quantity. But I think the other more interesting observation that did some meetings with our China economists over recent weeks is that we often from the West look in and think, China's economy is falling apart, but it's perhaps not the perception of Chinese policymakers. They're looking at 5% GDP and thinking, that's pretty good compared to what you guys are experiencing, and they're looking at low inflation and thinking, we'd actually rather have that than the high inflation that you guys are experiencing. So I think, I don't think it's a disaster, what we're seeing at the moment in China, and I certainly don't think it's a disaster for Australia as we sort of think about the read-through here. By a million miles, the key channel through which China impacts us here in Australia is the iron ore market. It dwarfs everything else. And, in prior cycles, 2014, big falls in the iron ore price, big negative income shock for the Australian economy. We saw tax increases, spending cuts, big falls in mining investment. But I think the whole setup sort of changed. That's my view. In a meaningful way. Of course, the iron ore price is much higher today. It's proving to be very resilient, $130 a tonne. I think on our forecast it stays triple figures for a couple of years. But I think the bigger deal is that we've reduced our vulnerability, I think, to big falls in the iron ore price through a number of different channels. The budget papers have very conservative assumptions on long-term prices, $55 a tonne. The Australian mining companies, their break-even cost of production is now $50 a tonne. Levels of mining investment are very, very low at the moment, relative to where they were 10 years ago. So it's not like that can ratchet lower. So I think the point I would make is that I see it more as glass half full. I think in that doomsday scenario where the iron ore price was, say, to halve overnight, I don't think that the headwinds to the Australian economy would be unmanageable at all. And I think it's a more nuanced situation. And actually the growth multipliers of China to Australia today are probably as low as they've been, in my view, for 15 years or so.
Yeah, thanks very much. Appreciate you unpacking some of that nuance for us. And you're absolutely right, 5% GDP growth is a pretty solid number that many economies would be happy with. Thank you for that. But I want to bring you into the conversation now. And the question I'm really keen to hear from you from a European perspective is around energy transition. We know that that's at the forefront of CEDA members' minds at the moment. So we're really keen to understand how is the energy transition playing out there in Europe and how that compares with other countries.
Thank you very much for being here. It's a pleasure. I have to say, if we look at the energy transition in Europe at the moment, then what we see is that there had been a big, ambitious program already put forward by the European Commission. Fit for 55, a plan that gets 40% emission reductions by 2030. Whereas a lot of plans before that were mainly focused on sort of headline reduction numbers, this is quite detailed in the sense that it really puts forward stepping stones for sectors to move towards that target. And on the one hand, that brings carrots with it, but it also means that you're going to see where the pain is going to be in more detail than just some signatures under a Paris Agreement and a lot of applause. It shows where the pain is going to be in the coming years. And I think that that's a very interesting example of how this is going to move. It started to cause more fierce lobbying from sectors that had trouble with some of the ambition. And we've even seen that to some degree that's led to a reduction of the ambition of targets. But at the same time, it also provides a very clear path that sectors are going to be taking in the coming years. And I think that that's actually leading to some results already. But if we look at the energy transition in Europe, then you have to mention the Russian war in Ukraine. We see, of course, that it's caused a lot of urgency around the energy transition here. We essentially had a model, especially strong, successful exporters like Germany, of relying on cheap gas coming through Russian pipes. And that's something that is largely over. And we know it's over for structurally. And we don't have any sustainable energy source at those cheap prices available to us at this point. And we already heard some concerns about the European economy. We see that part of that is coming from high energy prices in some of the more energy intensive sectors that are struggling. And it really makes the urgency for Europe to make a faster energy transition possible much bigger. And we see that there have been some new targets set, but at the same time, Europe moves in a sluggish way. And it's been the case for a long time, and we see that policymaking in Brussels continues to be like that. Even with the urgency becoming much stronger, we do see that it takes time for real big decisions to be made. And that's something that we are quite urgently waiting for. What we also see is that Europe lacks the big sort of carrot type programs that the US has. When you look at the IRA, for example, Europe has a much more measured plan of carrots and sticks. But if you look at what sort of investment boom you can expect on the back of that, it is quite meager. So for now, the urgency is high. There are detailed plans in place, but if we are expecting a big investment boom on the back of this, there are still some things to be ironed out. And hopefully the urgency will help to make that happen faster than what we've seen so far.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. The urgency is something that's being felt acutely here as well, and we've also got similar concerns around a slow bureaucratic process in terms of whether that's going to be able to deliver the change that we really need here. So some strong parallels there. Bert mentioned you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, so I might bring that back to Paul and bring it back to the US. That's one of the questions coming up with a lot of votes here from the audience. So thank you for those questions, and please keep them coming through. But yes, the Inflation Reduction Act. Our audience wants to know, what will the near-term impacts be?
Well, there's a number of them. I mean, the first one that's very clear is that it's seen an enormous ramp-up in investment in the US. Manufacturing investment has been picking up very, very substantially. It's assisting the US in making the energy transition. A lot of the Inflation Reduction Act is aimed at providing subsidies for the production, building capacity for the production of putting wind farms in place, solar panels, solar farms in place, and building battery capacity as well. It's been boosting the economy. It's been supporting growth. And I guess one of the questions early on, certainly that I was grappling with, or we were grappling with, was, would this boost demand more than it boosted supply. Would this sort of fiscal program where you provide subsidies and boost the economy at a time when inflation was still quite elevated, would that prove to be something that actually made inflation persist more? And I think the jury's out at the moment a little, because one of the things, as I noted earlier, that we've observed is the US has managed to bring inflation down quite quickly. It's done it without actually seeing much of a slowdown in demand. Growth is holding up, job creation is holding up, the supply side of the economy is improving. So it may prove that this is one element where, and if you add more investment and you build capital stock and you combine it with labour, that's often how you get productivity. And that might be one of the things that's actually been going on. A targeted US subsidy program that encourages business investment can actually lift productivity. It's not necessarily the full answer. I think also, my prior is that the US had a tougher time of the pandemic, had very differently designed policy strategies for supporting the households and business sector, and because it was more checks to households, they had a bigger shakeout as a result of the pandemic effect itself. They had a bigger rise in the unemployment rate, more corporate insolvencies, and as a result, a bigger recession that probably shook the economy more, and they are having more of, or at least an earlier form of, a cyclical recovery in productivity that often comes out of recessions, which we're not seeing so much in Europe, and we're certainly, I don't think, seeing in the same sort of way here in Australia. But I think the Inflation Reduction Act is seemingly delivering more on the supply side and helping in a broader sense for the US growth story. It's also delivering, by the way, higher US government deficits and higher US government debt. So that, I guess, is the other question about where they go from here in terms of that, the large deficits and the rising US government debt levels. More a geopolitical question, perhaps.
Thanks for that. And can I pick up on your comments on productivity there, because we've had a lot of votes on a question around the US and their productivity result, and what are they getting right and what can we learn from that? So you mentioned that part of that is as a cyclical recovery. Are there some structural things that they're doing well that we could be thinking about here in Australia as we look to improve our own productivity growth?
Well, I think that's the main one. I mean, if you look at Australia and you look at business investment as a share of GDP, it's basically been flat for the past 5 years. It hasn't done anything. We haven't seen a big revival in business investment. It's picked up a little, but it's really only keeping up with the pace of nominal GDP. We haven't been investing sufficiently to believe that you're going to get enough of a rise in the capital to labour ratio to allow you to get a productivity improvement. I mean, that's one aspect of the story. Another aspect may be that the US economy does prove to be fairly flexible. When it gets a shock, it shakes it up, it changes it around, they get a restructure, and then they get some sort of recovery in productivity. We designed policy quite differently here, as you would all be well aware. In fact, it was very much the edict from above that through the pandemic, the plan was to keep the economy, put the economy into deep freeze. We had JobKeeper and the corporate insolvency moratoria and the tax holidays and all very similar stuff to what Europe did as well, where we held the economy in stasis for an extended period of time with the intention that when the pandemic ended, we would thaw it out, defrost it, and we'd go into a recovery. But having done that, you didn't get a lot of change, right? You didn't shake everything on purpose. You did it on purpose, but you didn't get a lot of change. I think the US economy, there's some evidence that they had more change through that period of time. They had more of the sort of shakeout you get from a recession that's giving them the cyclical lift in productivity. So it's policy choices. I mean, it's not clear that necessarily one way is necessarily better than the other for social welfare, but the result of it may very well be that you aren't getting the lift in productivity at the tail end right now in Europe and Europe and Australia that you are potentially in the US.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a question here, sticking on policy for a minute, about industrial policy. Andrew, maybe I'll throw this one to you, but happy for the other panellists to jump in as well. The question is, are governments getting industrial policy right? What's working and what could be improved?
I think broadly we're getting things right, and a testament to that is how well the Australian economy navigated a pretty extraordinary adjustment through the COVID years, where we saw really very, very good outcomes in the labour market more broadly, overall at a macro level, I would say. And we've come out the other end with full employment, or actually probably even better than full employment. And I don't think we should take that for granted, because if you remember pre-COVID, we really didn't have that. We had unemployment rates well north of 5%. We had 10 years of wages growth that, was really subnormal trends, and that contributed to a 7-year undershoot of the inflation target. So I think, we do have a very dynamic labour market, I would say, flexible labour market. Perhaps in those pre-COVID years, it was a little bit too flexible, and some of the changes that have been made more recently on the IR side of things, it's sort of looking to rebalance things a little bit, and it's a good thing that that's happening in a labour market that's particularly tight at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. But I might bring you into the labour markets discussion. Keen for your perspective on that. We've got a very highly voted question around labour markets. Cassandra said just before that the key to our success will be our skilled, flexible and innovative workplace. So how are you seeing labour markets playing out in Europe, and what do you see as the most important role for leaders when it comes to the labour market?
Europe, we're experiencing something relatively similar to Australia. I mean, we've got very low unemployment rates, despite an economy that has essentially flatlined since the start of the energy crisis that we've experienced here. And when we look at how the labor market is currently being looked at, then it's really concerns about shortages in the longer term that are becoming more and more problematic. We've essentially seen labor market tightness increase significantly after the start of the pandemic, especially after the first few lockdowns. And we're getting to a point now where demographics are starting to weigh significantly on Europe's total workforce potential. So in Europe, it's very much about how you can continue to use older workers more efficiently, pull them back into the labor force perhaps, or at least continue to use them efficiently longer to make sure that labor shortages become less of a problem. And we see, maybe to add on to that as a final point, what we see in Europe is a very curious case where hours worked on average have fallen quite significantly. So Europeans used to work an X amount of hours per week in the fourth quarter of 2019. After that, it's dropped massively during the pandemic, also in part because of government incentives to keep people employed. And we haven't recovered near the number of hours that people were working prior to the pandemic. And there are quite a few factors that play into this. But ultimately, with that, Europe is creating its own labor shortages, which is great for people that receive higher wages on the back of that, but worrisome when you look at the potential growth for the Eurozone economy in the years ahead, when demographics start weighing on the potential output anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. We're grappling, as you say, with similar issues here, and thinking about the best ways we can utilise our labour resources here in Australia. And our research on work from home has shown that one of the benefits there is that we can get people into the workforce who otherwise would not be working as much. So people who have a stronger preference for work from home, like women with young children and people with a disability or health condition. That's been a real win for work from home, and that has benefits for the broader capacity of the labour market as well. So that's one area we've been thinking about here. I want to come back to the US because we've got quite a few questions here, and we can't really have a global economy discussion without discussing the US election. So there's questions here about what do you think the impact of that will have, that election will have on the global economy, and of course the implications here for Australia.
So we've started to do a bit of work on this and set out some views. I guess the starting point is it's looking increasingly likely as though Donald Trump is going to be the nominee for the Republicans. It's still unclear, of course, who's going to win the next election. But I think we need to start gaming out what another Trump presidency might mean for the overall global economic picture. And to do that, I guess we've got sort of four key baskets that we've been thinking through. The first is sort of fiscal policy. The second is trade policy. The third is central bank and what it means for the Fed. And the fourth is geopolitics. And if you think about the first basket, one thing that seems likely and is certainly part of the campaign is that a Trump presidency might deliver another unfunded tax cut that's tilted to the top end of the income distribution. That's what that's what happened last time around. That's happened under previous Republican administrations, and it's a part of his campaign as well. And if that were to happen, that would mean that we would have an extended period. We've already got quite large budget deficits in the US. They're running at about 8% of GDP, which is quite extraordinarily large given the situation, given the US actually growth is actually holding up pretty well. That would persist or potentially get larger. We could think about this as maybe supporting growth to some degree, but probably more importantly, seeing continued deficits, which mean government debt levels continue to rise. And at some point, maybe the global market will start to test this a little bit, and it might end up in the term premium for the bond market. So we should think about that as a risk for rates being maybe a little higher for longer, potentially. Second risk, probably the biggest one, the one that I think is the one that most critically affects the global picture, is trade policy, because the Trump campaign has said that the strategy would be to put a 10% tariff on imports, all imports into the US, and potentially one that's much higher for China. Now, if they go down that pathway, that gums up the global trade system. It regionalises trade. It slows down global growth potentially. It might also challenge China, because China's got a lot of domestic economic challenges right now, particularly in its property sector. One way out of that is to try to grow in terms of exporting more products into the energy transition, the electric vehicle story, the motor vehicle story, the solar panels, batteries and so on. But if they're challenged by the fact that they can't sell into the world quite as much, that might present another headwind for the China growth story. So I think the trade policy story is obviously another one to watch, and another one that potentially is inflationary, is potentially another risk, is another potential risk for rates being more elevated for a more extended period of time. The third one is central bank independence. I'll try to be brief, but Trump has said that he won't reappoint Jerome Powell, and whoever the next president of the United States is gets to appoint the next Fed chair. So, there's a question, at least, to be asked around whether the Fed remains as independent and whether the next appointee runs the Fed in such a way that is as independent as it has been. And if they do, that's great. And if they don't, again, something to keep in mind in terms of the inflation outlook and the risk outlook. And the fourth one, well, geopolitics. And we can all have a think about what that all might mean, but presumably it's a challenge to what's going on in Eastern Europe and to Ukraine, and maybe Bert will have some comments to make about that, and potentially also a question around what's happening in the South China Sea and in Asia. So there's an enormous amount of change that could come along from all of this. It's hard to know how to think about it all, but we're starting to game out what potential risks are and how we should think about them in terms of market implications.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'm keen to get on to the geopolitical discussion, but just before we move off the US, there's a question here about the US and its global dominance, or potentially losing that global dominance, and what that means for Australian policy, Australian diplomacy and defence policy, and whether we should be shifting our focus to sort of better reflect our economic and trade ties, and how we continue picking sides in these tensions. So where do you think our focus needs to be in a policy sense as these sort of, we have these changing tides in global power shifts, I guess?
Is this one for me as well?
Sure. If you like.
Andrew? So this is a great challenge that our major trading partners are in Asia. Our single largest trading partner is China, but our primary strategic relationship, as it has been post-war and even potentially longer, has been with the US. And we have to find a way to balance both those priorities, and we are working through that. I guess one of the perspectives that I bring to this, working for a global bank and a bank that's that's got a huge Asia focus, is we're not alone in this story. Like, we always sit down here in Australia and have a discussion about it as though, we've got this tie and we've got that tie. But actually, a lot of the countries in Asia obviously have very similar sorts of circumstances. And so they're all having to juggle with it as well, and closer to all things in terms of trade relations, but also strategic relations. So I don't think it's an easy one, but I think it's one that we just have to manage. It's not one that you can change rapidly. You just have to manage it.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. But I might come to you on the geopolitical question and broadening that out beyond the US. Obviously there's a number of conflicts, some of them closer to your region than ours. But in Asia, there's obviously risks around Taiwan. So a lot of geopolitical uncertainty, attacks on ships in the Red Sea. How concerned should we be about all of this from an economic perspective and also for the outlook for global trade?
So maybe starting out with the first part, the US part. When you look at it from a European point of view, I agree very much with Paul's 4 points that he made. But here in Europe, the emphasis is much more on the geopolitical concerns when you look at the European economy than on the trade element of it. And you see that nations here in Europe are grappling to reach the 2% target of defense spending of GDP that Trump has been very vocal about that countries should adhere to. At the same time, you see that him mentioning of how he would end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours is something that here in Europe has really caused a lot of thinking on our positions geopolitically and what that would mean from an economic perspective. At least it means for now that there's more defense spending to be done. And as opposed to the US, we have budget rules here that we have to adhere to, at least to some degree. And that means that you see that countries are focusing on or are having to take a good hard look at budget deficits that have ran up over the post-COVID period. With increased defense spending, increased energy transition spending, you see that the impact of the war in Ukraine is having a really big ripple effect on the total European economy, more so than the pandemic in fact did. Looking at further concerns, the Red Sea at this point, I think for European companies, it's more of another wake-up call yet again that global spread-out supply chains are risky and pose vulnerability. At the same time, I get our clients asking me all the time whether we already see that there's a lot of deglobalization happening. And when I ask them the question back, well, are you putting production back to Europe? All their answers are, oh, no, not us. No, we're actually looking to expand in India or set up something in Vietnam as a sort of a measure of de-risking against China, for example. So you see that companies are thinking about it, but Asia is just very attractive as a global production site as opposed to Europe. So you see that there's not really any real sign of deglobalization happening so far. And while at this point you see some impact on global trade, it's also more reflecting the goods cycle that's at a weak point globally at this point. And we see that global trade is just generally impacted by relatively weak economic activity in Europe, some disappointments in China. I wouldn't say that we're now at the start of a real change in terms of globalization on the back of the problems that we're seeing in the Middle East.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. Andrew, there's a question here. Obviously, one of the key ways that our economy is affected by things outside our borders is migration, and it's a topic that CEDA has thought about and advocated on for a long time. The borders were shut for quite a long time, and then we have had this big influx of migrants since mid last year. What are you seeing as the impact on Australia's economy of that change, and what are your thoughts on the migration effect going forward?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first observation I would make is that Australia has been for a couple of hundred years a nation built on strong migration, and so it's not new really that we've had strong rates of migration. Of course, it's been supercharged through the COVID years. We had that pent-up demand and that sort of process through. In terms of the and it's been a good thing, a very good thing for our nation, I would say, building out capacity and across a cultural and a number of different dimensions beyond economic ones, very important things. And I think it's one of the great things about our country. But through the COVID years, in terms of the macroeconomic impact, in the nearer term, I think it has been quite inflationary. And it has made life more difficult for policymakers, including at Martin Place, and has contributed to very strong rates of growth in residential rent, which is the largest single component of the inflation basket. And it's also provided a tailwind to the housing market as well, which is good and creating activity and demand, construction activity and employment, but it also is inflationary. So I think it has been a factor to higher interest rates in the shorter term. Now, the argument is, of course, that this migration is a positive labour supply shock, and so will ease pressure in the labour market and ease labour shortages over time as well. I think that that's true, But again, I think it's a longer run story, and I think there's a bit of nuance to it, because you have to remember, of course, it's also a positive labour demand shock. You're bringing in all these people that need somewhere to live, most obviously, but they need somewhere to send their kids to school, and they need all these different public services. So it's a delicate balancing act. I think Australia's generally got the mix right over a long period of time, but clearly there are some. It's been a more challenging environment at the moment, given the very unusual COVID situation with the borders, as you say, Melissa.
Yeah, absolutely. Very unusual circumstances as we went into that pandemic, and then also feeling the ripple effects coming back out. You touched on inflation and interest rate policy, and there's a question around that more broadly, sort of thinking about are central banks aiming for the right level when it comes to inflation and interest rates, or should we be aiming for slightly higher inflation, which may encourage increased economic activity? It changes the equation for debt, things like that. Do you think we've got the right targets?
I think we have the right targets, and I think that once you start moving those, well, first of all, the observation is that that monetary policy and having these inflation targeting systems have worked very well for us, particularly in Australia, for a long period of time. And we have actually pretty low levels of, perhaps not here in Victoria, but public debt, in the Commonwealth. So I don't really see that as a compelling argument to lift the inflation target here. And I think the question always is, if the central bank does lift the inflation target, markets will second guess, when are they going to change it again? When are they going to lift it again? So I think I don't really care whether it's 2% or 3% or 1%, but I think having a fixed range around that level, certainly above zero, is a good thing. And I don't really see any urgency to change it. And just on the inflation piece, I would observe that Paul mentioned this in his earlier answer. I mean, we've made a lot of progress in reducing inflation back to these inflation targets already. So we're almost there. In the US, for example, core PCE inflation, which is what the Fed's most focused on, you look at 6-month annualised rates of that now, the last couple of months, they're sub 2%. And then if you look more closely on where we are here in Australia, Q4 CPI, true mean CPI, annualised at 3.1%. So, just at the top of that target band. So I would say we stick with what we've got, and it's done a very good job for us for a long period of time.
Yeah, so monetary policy is working. Inflation might be higher, but it's definitely heading in the right direction. Paul, I'm going to give this one to you because it mentions your boss. The CEO of HSBC said on Bloomberg yesterday that real estate markets in China had bottomed and it needs to recover. What does that mean for the iron ore market here in Australia?
Well, I'm certainly not going to comment on HSBC's boss and what he has to say, but I can talk about our outlook for the property sector in China, and I can also talk about its implications for commodities. So the house view is that China's growth will print at 4.9% this year. That puts us a little bit above the consensus, which is 4.6. The two primary areas where we're a bit more optimistic than the street, than the consensus, is around the idea that the property sector stabilises rather than continues to fall. And I'm going to clarify that a little bit. The consensus in the market is that property sector will keep going backwards. There'll continue to be a decline in investment in the property sector, a decline in sales. And what we're saying is it'll be flat, it'll stabilise. So not contributing to growth, still got a growth headwind and a pretty decent growth challenge, but that's the house view. And then the other element of that is that the consumer might hold up a little bit better as well. So we're at the upper end of the spectrum in terms of the distribution of outcomes in terms of the outlook for China's growth. I guess on the metal story, much like Andrew's point, it is surprising how resilient demand for hard commodities has been in the face of what has been a very large correction or a continuing correction in the Chinese property sector. Last year, property investment fell 12%, property sales fell 17%. They're having a very decent property correction that will probably be persistent for a period, or has been persistent. And in the face of that, you might have thought that would weaken demand for metals, for iron ore and so on. But what has happened in the end is iron ore has actually held up pretty well. Metals prices have generally held up pretty well. Coking coal's over 160 a tonne, copper's over 8,000 a tonne, iron ore's at about 120, 125. a tonne. These are reasonably positive numbers. And so what you can say is all of the other things that are going on that are supporting growth in China, and in particular this investment that's going on in the manufacturing industry, the building of solar panels. They're the largest producer of solar panels, wind farm equipment, the largest producer of motor vehicles, the largest exporter of motor vehicles, the largest exporter of electric vehicles, as well as, I might add, it's not just a China story, global demand for those products, because you've got things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which are driving, yes, more production onshore in the US, but they're also driving investment in that space. So you've got an investment story going on globally. That has added up seemingly to deliver support for demand for metals that are holding up reasonably well. Now, I guess the final remark is if the property sector stabilises, which is the house view, and the Chinese keep pulling levers to support growth, and as they do, I think my rule of thumb is typically the more they pull the levers, the more commodity intensive their levers tend to get. That should provide some support. We think that those prices should stay up, at reasonably elevated levels, and that's a good story for Australia because, of course, it means more income off the back of our commodity exports. I agree with Andrew, though. There isn't a lot of investment going on in the resources industry, so it's not driving as big a cycle as it has done in the past, the connections with China and commodities, but we do get the income, and then that ends up in the government coffers and it supports the corporate sector and so on. So, we think that that's our central case.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul. There's a question coming through, a big sort of issue that we haven't touched on yet that we really, really must, is technological change. We've rightly had a question point out that this is massive technological change going on at the moment, and the question is, how do we see this impacting on global economies and trade and geopolitical and populations? So a big question around technological progress. But did you want to share your thoughts on that one with us?
I mean, that's a very, very broad question, of course. And I think, what we've been grappling with is how technological change is going to ultimately result in higher economic activity through better productivity numbers. And even though there are some encouraging signs from the United States, overall we see that productivity growth has been very lackluster coming into the pandemic and afterwards, especially where I'm sitting here in Europe. That's also still been the case. And of course, I mean, there's a lot of excitement about AI being sort of the next big driver from technological progress point of view of economic activity. I certainly buy into that story. The big question, of course, is the timing and when we're really going to see that feed through into productivity numbers structurally. There's a lot of concerns about what this is going to do to jobs. Historically, we haven't seen any big general purpose technologies come through that ultimately resulted in net job losses. So I think that that's a very encouraging sign. The question is if it's going to be big enough of a shock for that to happen. But given all the labor shortages problems that we're seeing, I would hope that we start to see the impact on the economy sooner rather than later for that to happen. I think that that's sort of the big one that we're at least looking at that could bring at least Europe to a degree out of its relatively lackluster growth environment in the medium term.
Yeah, thanks, Bert. It's a big topic, so I want to give the other panellists an opportunity to jump in on technological change, your views.
I mean, I would just make a very high-level observation that we keep tabs of the number of people that read our research at Goldman Sachs, and the most read piece of research over the last 12 months by a million miles is a piece on artificial intelligence and the read-through for productivity, written by a colleague of mine in New York. And just to give you the very high-level sort of punchline, with all the caveats around trying to model this stuff, and there are enormous caveats, their assessment is that the generative AI could be as impactful for the global economy as was the introduction of the electric engine and as was the introduction of the personal computer in, I think it was the early 80s. Now, if that's the case, and they look at all the types of jobs that people do in the economy, what can be sort of automised by AI and how will it be, to what degree and so on, and what are the productivity enhancements from that? They tally it all up. Again, big caveats around it, but they're talking about 10 to 15% gain to productivity over sort of a 10-year period, with, again, big caveats, as Bert said, around adoption rates and how quickly this can happen. But yeah, it's a big deal.
Yeah, well, I think that's the question, or one of the big questions is these technologies come along, and clearly this is perceived as one that could really change things substantially, but the timing is so uncertain. The question is, when does it actually have its effect? When is it, and how quickly is it adopted? And then the other one is, historically, what happens? We get these technologies, they come along, they're wonderful, but we don't quite know exactly how to make best use of them, and it takes us a while to work out what that is, and it's not clear exactly what, where it's going to show up and what it's going to do and over what time frame. And then if you sort of connect that back to markets, well, last year, the US stock market was on a tear. I mean, the global stock market was, but it's been driven by the Magnificent Seven, the tech firms. They're the primary driver of that. And a lot of that story is all around AI. So is all of that price rise, I think they went up 55% last year. All of that price rise, is it genuinely justified in a short enough time horizon to justify where the markets are? Or are we due for a correction at some point? Because actually it takes a while longer, and we just don't quite know where this technology is going to show up in terms of how it's going to, and over what time frame, and exactly how it's going to enhance productivity. I guess one final remark is, one of Australia's great strengths, at least in the literature that I'm aware of, is we don't tend to be a leader in terms of the development of these technologies, but we tend to be very, very rapid adopters of technologies once they become available. So this is the thing to watch out for, how it is that it can change our business practices, and how it is that it can be something that is an additional support for improving our pretty dismal productivity performance. I don't think I said this right at the beginning, because this is a global context. But if you look at the developed world, we're pretty much bottom of the pile in terms of where productivity has been in the post-pandemic period. The US is leading the way, Europe's sitting there, but actually, Australia is actually even further below Europe if you look at the aggregate productivity statistics. It may be that there's measurement issues, yes, sure, but are the measurement issues big enough to get you that really big gap? I'm not sure. I suspect that this will be the topic of your following discussions after this, yes?
Yes, very much looking forward to the productivity discussion after lunch, so thank you for that fantastic segue. One more question I think we've got time for from this list here. I will hold off on what's currently the most voted question because it's got a domestic focus, but Andrew Barker, heads up that people are very keen to hear about the issues around construction and infrastructure costs, particularly in Victoria, so that might be one for the domestic panel coming up next. But the last question I'm going to take from this list is around inclusivity. Obviously, that's something that's very high on the minds of CEDA members and the CEDA research team here as well. Open to anyone on the panel who would like to say, what do you see as the key opportunities in the year ahead for governments to shape a more inclusive economy?
I think, this was Julia Gillard's big thing, wasn't when she was in power, is that, being able to work and participate in the labour market is just such a really important part of people's welfare, physically, mentally, and all those kinds of things. So I think if we can engineer, broader macro environment, economic conditions such that we get as many people into the workforce as is possible while maintaining, stable inflation environment, I would say that at a high level is going to be a very productive way about, an essential aspect of it, I think, that should underpin all the sort of micro measures that you might perhaps talk about.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that the pandemic did is changed workplace behaviour. Obviously, work from home, and there's questions around it and so on. But you relayed this a little earlier in your own research that it has increased flexibility. I mean, we talk about it as work from home, but actually what it is an extension of what was already going on, which was a trend towards increased workplace flexibility, which allowed greater and broader participation in the labour market, particularly of people who are caregivers. So while there's often a discussion around the work from home may be one of the issues related to productivity weakness, it's also worth keeping in mind that it's actually one of the things that's allowing greater participation and a broader inclusiveness in the labour market. So we have to find our way through, how we balance those priorities.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to ask you all for your quick 1 minute pitch on bringing it back to the outlook for the global economy over the year ahead. Each of you, just briefly, if you could tell me what you currently see as the biggest risk or uncertainty for the global economy over the year ahead, and what is the indicator, what is the piece of data or the other signal that you're looking to get a clearer read on that risk or uncertainty as the year evolves. Bert, can I go to you first, please?
And I think, maybe the key data point to look at is polls for the U.S. election. I mean, there are a few, but let's just end on just that. When I look at it from a European perspective, but also from an American perspective, the U.S. elections are very important. And if we want to get a good grasp of where the economy is headed, perhaps not over the course of this year, but for the somewhat medium-term path, then the U.S. elections are going to be very important for that. So if you want to have something that's a key guideline, there are so many elections going on this year. There's one that really matters. We have one in Europe. People don't even know when it is, but ask them when the U.S. elections are, they will know. And it's because they're so important from a geopolitical perspective and an economic perspective for Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much, Bert. Paul, Andrew?
Yeah, so mine would be an extension of a similar point. I mean, the US election is going to be an enormous global event to watch, and then I guess it's all about what it means. And I guess when I think about global risks at the moment, the one I'm probably primarily worried about in a sort of 12 to 24 month horizon is the possibility and risk of rising protectionism, the trade policy story that comes out of the back of those geopolitical forces, and particularly what might happen in terms of the US. I think that's the one, at least in my mind, that globally we ought to be very focused on.
Thanks, Paul. Andrew?
At risk of repeating things, I would say we had this big conference in Hong Kong 2 weeks ago, Goldman Sachs, and they get 2,000 clients in the room to respond to a survey question similar to this. And we did it 12 months ago, and it was all US recession. They did it 2 weeks ago, and it was geopolitics and the US election. So the additional observation I would make on that is just that if 2016 and 2020 are anything to go by, those elections, markets didn't tend to start to price in potential outcomes until much closer to the election day. And I think Trump winning is one thing. Does he get a Republican sweep? That's another thing altogether. So look, yeah, I agree with Bert and Paul. We'll have to watch not only the polls, but I think the prediction markets actually tend to do an even better job of predicting outcomes through the course of the year.
Thanks very much. So all eyes on the US election. We're out of time. Thank you to our panellists. It's been such a wide-ranging and thought-provoking dive into issues affecting the global economy and what that means for Australia over the year ahead. Can you please join me in thanking our panellists, Paul, Andrew and Bert?